So we're doing our first crossover episode this week, and I wanted to ask you what your favorite crossover episode of all time is.
Boy, that is tough. I mean, recently it's been the Lower Decks Strange New Worlds crossover where Tawny Newsome and Jack Quaid showed up as their animated characters, but in a real life Star Trek show, which was really, really awesome. I mean, it helps when the actors that voice animated characters actually look like the real life people. So yeah, that was really fun. What's yours?
I probably could have guessed that it would have something to do with Star Trek.
Yeah.
Mine's going to be the 2004 Jimmy Timmy Power Hour, which was a Jimmy Neutron Fairly Odd Parents crossover. And I was obsessed with both of those shows, and I couldn't believe it was like a really unholy alliance of CG, like 2004 CG and like animation, but I loved it. I was obsessed with both of those shows.
Uncanny Valley
Exactly.
time. We went down the rabbit hole a little bit on this idea of crossover, and did you know that the very first crossover episode as we know them today was I Love Lucy meets The Adventures of Superman.
I could not believe that. I'd watched both of those shows when I was a kid, and I never knew they had a crossover. That's insane.
Yeah,
Incredible.
Lucy ended up in a Superman costume out on a window ledge, and George Reeves, the actor who played Superman in that show, showed up and saved her. So yeah, it was very exciting, I'm sure, for every fan of 1950s television.
And I thought Christopher Reeves on Smallville was the best Superman crossover ever. We're going to blow away all those crossovers. This week, it's booming times sound politics.
Let's do this. Welcome to Sound Politics. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. And I knew it was Christopher Reeve. I just forgot for a second because of George Reeves.
Geesh. Good thing you got that corrected. So I just want to thank everybody who emailed us and told us about what they want to hear on Sound Politics this year. It was really great to see so many messages.
That email address, by the way, if you want to email us, if you didn't get a chance to, soundpolitics@KUOW.org.
Right. And one of the things several of you said is that you only want to hear about the Trump administration when they do something that has clear and material effects locally. So today we're just going to touch on a Trump thing, one thing that hit home here this week, and then we're going to dive into the most local of local issues, a housing ballot measure coming up in a Seattle special election.
Yay, more voting.
It never stops, can't stop, won't stop. Okay, Scott, but first, let's talk about some of the local whiplash from the first 10 days of the Trump administration. Earlier this week, the White House issued a directive that froze potentially trillions of dollars in federal grants and loans. That order was first halted by a judge, then rescinded a day later. But for 24 hours or so, there was total confusion over the future of funding for hospitals, schools, nonprofits. And here in the Pacific Northwest, it caused real panic. What were people telling you?
Yeah, the word Washington Senator Patty Murray used is sheer panic. Medina Congresswoman Susan DelBene called it a one-man government shutdown. The state treasurer told me the directive was, quote, insane. Those are all Democratic leaders, and they all said it was illegal too. They said, people were calling them just saying, what is going on? Do I have funding? This memo they're talking about was from the Office of Management and Budget and basically said that they want to root out things like, and I'm also quoting here, Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering policies. And they also wanted to pause all federal financial assistance while they do that. And the pause is where the confusion really came in. So I spoke to folks in nonprofits and social services who said some federal payment portals were down on Tuesday.
Yeah, Medicaid.
That's right. For a bit, they were scared they would lose access to things like housing support for domestic violence survivors, utility assistance for low-income folks, just all sorts of stuff that the federal government funds. And like you said, Libby, the order has been rescinded. Those payment portals, I think, for the most part, are back up. These folks are still nervous about the future and just like, will the funds even arrive in our bank accounts? I should mention the White House has blamed the media and the courts for all this confusion. But I mean, I read the memo and I can see why people were confused.
Yeah. Let's not forget there's still more confusion going forward because even after the memo was rescinded, the White House press secretary Carolyn Leavitt tweeted that the actual funding freeze had not been rescinded. And that prompted a federal judge to still issue a temporary restraining order to block the Trump orders. So in a word, chaos. He's testing every limit of presidential power here, like congressional purse strings. Nah, maybe not. And it appears intentionally to be Trump really poking a stick in the gears of the federal government to forward his ideological goals.
If you're a federal government employee or a contractor right now, it does feel like chaos. One federal employee who emailed us said, I feel like I am in the middle of a tsunami. I hear stories of people spending lots of time answering calls from people just saying, what is going on? And they were all, kind of confused by all of it, even just like going forward, what they want to get rid of, things like Marxist equity and Green New Deal social engineering. People talking to me are like, what is that?
The Green New Deal did not pass. It was never a piece of legislation.
Yeah. So apparently the Trump administration will be releasing more guidelines on what specifically they're talking about soon.
Okay. Well, speaking of soon, yeah, that's my pivot. Deal with
pivot.
it. I did promise that the episode would not all be about Trump. There's a special election coming up in Washington state on February 11th. And in Seattle, there's something of a big decision on voters' plates that's a new way of creating and paying for housing. So 2 years ago, in a special election like this one, Seattle voters agreed to try this new type of housing, social housing, that we're going to talk about. So the initiative, which passed, set up a public developer to do the work, but it didn't provide a funding source. So next month in another special election, voters are going to decide on how to pay for it. And we wanted to talk about this on the show because it's a complicated ballot question, which we love.
Yes.
But even if you're not a Seattle voter, it raises tons of interesting questions about how we build housing, who we should be building housing for, and how we should be paying for it. And proposals like this, Scott, they're popping up all over the nation, all over the world.
Absolutely. It's something that Seattle voters are deciding on that many other voters may have to consider in the future. I'm so excited to hear about it. I've covered some of this in the past, but it's a topic I'm really interested in. However, we have KUOW's growth and development reporter Joshua McNichols, who took a break from his podcast Booming to pop by and sit down with you, Libby, to talk social housing. It's a crossover episode.
Crossover alert.
The Libby Joshua Power half hour.
Let's do it.
Here's that conversation.
Joshua McNichols is KUOW's growth and development reporter, and he hosts the podcast Booming from KUOW, our sister podcast, I would say. We're like sister podcasts.
Yeah, we're siblings.
And he's here to talk about social housing. Hi, Joshua. Thanks for being here.
Hey, no problem.
Okay, we're going to get into specifics about these ballot propositions in just a moment, but I want to start with the basic question. So what is social housing? I feel like it's one of those things like the recipe for cacio e pepe, which I always thought I knew and understood, but I truly did not. And now that, it's before me and I'm going to be eating a bowl of social housing or cacio e pepe, I really need to be explained to, like, what actually is social housing.
Well, what is cacio e pepe first?
It's pasta.
Okay, it's
but
pasta.
Don't ask me anything deeper than that. You see, it's one of those things I've always nodded along and said, oh, yeah, I understand it.
Well, I love the recipe analogy because, there are so many different recipes for social housing. Like, there are several cities around the U.S. that are looking at it, and they're each picking different ingredients to make up their particular brand of cacio e pepe. So, many of them share certain qualities in common. They're based on this European housing model that means it's publicly owned housing, and it includes a wider range of incomes than affordable housing traditionally does in the U.S. It's got some tools that make it a little different that should allow it theoretically to rapidly scale up housing production and also to insulate that housing from market forces.
So voters approved the creation of a social housing developer in Seattle in 2023. And the run-up to that special election, during the run-up, there was concern from the Seattle Times editorial board, for example, and some affordable housing providers that social housing would provide housing for people who were well over the median income for an area. So they earned up to $126,000 a year. The critics' argument goes that city money should be focused on building only affordable housing. So for people with income well below the median in Seattle, which is desperately needed right now. I think a lot of people would agree. Does this kind of social housing, Joshua, mean subsidizing housing for people who make say, six-figure incomes.
Yes, it does.
All right.
I mean, the subsidy that people get when they make that much money is much less than the subsidy they'll get if they're low-income households. The idea is that the target here is for every renter in social housing to pay, no more than 30% of their income in housing costs. And that means rent and utilities and stuff. And so people who make less pay less, and people who make more pay more. And the idea is that you have a mix of these incomes in a building, and that the people earning more at the top help offset the low rents that come in from people at the bottom. And that it's this broadness, this diversity of incomes that kind of make the projects pencil out and make them able to, theoretically, they say, do more with less. And so the range of incomes that this can go up to is $126,000 for a single person. That's someone who's making 120% of what's called the area median income. A lot of people, even the opposition, have sort of latched onto that and said, is this really fair? Should this person be getting a subsidy like that? And they're not getting that much of a subsidy. They actually might be paying something closer to market rate at that income level. And another argument that social housing people make is that almost half of renters in Seattle are rent burdened. That means people who are paying more than 30% of their income in housing costs. People aren't supposed to pay that much for housing, at least as far as the U.S. government is concerned. The census has tracked cost burden and housing cost burdens for a long time and always sought to get that number down so that people are only paying 30%.
Yeah. But in Seattle, a place where the cost of housing has gone up and up and up, even people who make close to or over the area median income find themselves in positions where they can't find housing that, is for less than a third of their incomes. That would be the argument, at least from advocates for social housing. You broke down social housing as a concept in a lot more detail on a recent episode of Booming. And so I do encourage folks to check that out if they want more into the ideas behind it and, more detail on that. But let's get to the politics at hand, because this is sound politics after all. The deadline to vote in Seattle is February 11th on these dueling social housing ballot measures. If Seattle voters open their ballots, they're going to have two options in front of them, Proposition 1A and Proposition 1B. So let's walk through each one separately, Joshua, starting with 1A. What is it?
Well, 1A would create a new tax on wealthy companies. And it's kind of based on Seattle's Jumpstart tax. It's the same kind of structure, which is a tax on what they call excess compensation. That means when employees earn a whole bunch of money, the companies have to pay a tax on what is considered excess salaries. In the case of social housing, its version of this would charge 5% on salaries above $1 million. So say if an employee is earning $2 million, and that includes their stocks and stuff like that. So it's not just salary.
The total compensation.
If their total compensation is $2 million, then 5% of that would be $50,000 that would go to the social housing developer.
Because you're taxing every dollar over $1 million.
Yes, exactly. So it's a little complicated, but in the world of affordable housing providers, this new tax makes them kind of special. It's like showing up to a birthday party with your own personal cake.
Wow, I'm really getting a recipe theme here.
Yeah.
Give me by your own personal cake. You mean they have this
They have their own tax. Okay, so I'm likening cake to tax dollars allocated to you. In the current way of doing things, every year the city sort of says, okay, we're going to spend this much on affordable housing. And they basically dole that money out through a competitive process where they say, okay, this is the amount of money we have available. Everybody submit. They call them requests for proposals. And these affordable housing providers say, well, we can build this much housing for this much money. And maybe they get an award, maybe they don't.
But they're all competing for the same pot of money or same cake.
Yeah, exactly. And a big part of that cake is the Jumpstart tax. And so in walks social housing saying, we're going to have a new tax. It's kind of like your tax, but it's its own thing. All the money's going to us, minus a small administrative amount that goes to the city. And it's like they walk in with their own birthday cake.
Okay, so this would be a new tax in Proposition 1A. Again, it would tax compensation of every dollar over $1 million. including benefits like stocks. And it would all go to fund this projects from this new affordable housing development agency that voters approved a couple years ago. What about Proposition 1B? How is it different? Because voters are going to be looking at these two and thinking, how do I tell the difference between them?
Well, 1B basically says, no, you can't have your own cake. Instead, we've already served all the cake. So you're going to have to eat off your sister's plate.
Such a mean dad. And when you talk about the existing cake, you're talking about the jumpstart tax, the existing payroll tax on big corporations in Seattle. Proponents of 1B are saying, you got to make your social housing development authority work with funds from the jumpstart tax, right?
Exactly. Now, the social housing developer has a few advantages given by the city council under Proposition 1B. It gets its $10 million without having to compete with other housing providers. But because it's coming from the same pool, because this person is having to share their birthday cake with off everybody else's plates, it's kind of a guaranteed way to make all the other affordable housing providers mad at you because it means less cake for them. There's some other things about Proposition 1B, too, that are important to understand. One is that the city council, which has the authority to do this, is saying, we want a little bit more accountability from you. We want you to show us that you've got your financial models in place, that you've hired a CEO, which they've already done. You've hired a CFO, and we just want to know that this is going to work economically. And we're going to put the Seattle Office of Housing in charge of determining whether that's the case. And if you don't meet our criteria, eventually the money that we were going to give to you is going to go to other affordable housing projects.
So they kind of be treating social housing as more of an experiment that has to have accountability, follow-ups, and then might eventually end because it wouldn't have its own funding source under 1B the way that Proposition 1A suggests.
Yes, and the city council has expressed a lot of, verbally they're saying we support this idea, we want it to succeed, we just think it needs to have some training wheels, and then we'll let it free later if it kind of proves itself. But on the other hand, you can kind of read between the lines politically. And, this was an idea that was beloved by Tammy Morales, who left the city council, talking about being bullied there, basically.
Yeah, progressive member of the city council who recently stepped down.
Yeah. And so, this is also called social housing, which even though it's being explored by many different cities across the U.S., most of them don't call it social housing. It kind of harkens to a more, social safety net kind of way of thinking about the world.
In Seattle, we're loud and proud about calling it social housing.
Right. And I mean, I don't know the particular politics in internal motivations of city council members on that, but just understanding that it's associated with a former city council member who, by her words, was, by her interpretation, was kind of drummed out of there. It's not totally surprising that there's some skepticism on the city council about this. But there's one more really important thing that makes Proposition 1B different. And that is that there is a cap on the income levels that is much lower for social housing than is their original intent. With 1A, they can provide housing for people making up to 120% of the area median income. That's $126,000 for a single person. But with 1B, they say, no, that's way too high. You got to bring that down to 80% of the area median income, which is traditionally what housing providers call workforce housing, which means it's not going to include attorneys. I often say that, social housing could include attorneys, but not like the really rich ones, rather public defenders. But this will kind of bring the level down from that. And we're probably talking about some teachers and stuff, but we're not probably talking about firefighters who earn more,
Not nobody who's making six figures like under 1A.
Yes.
So let me just recap really quickly in two columns. One is the 1A proposal, which creates a new tax. We've got, income levels allowed in these buildings up to 120% area median income and kind of just more freedom because you have a distinct revenue source pushing this forward and fueling the projects from the Public Development Authority. Now, on the other side, you have 1B, which would require social housing to be built with a stream from existing tax revenue from the jumpstart tax. It would create a bunch of accountability measures about the type of leadership and check-ins, financial oversight, with the Public Development Authority, and it would lower the median income that's allowed in the building, lower than what's allowed in 1A.
Well, that is a really important difference because social housing fans argue that it is that diversity of incomes that make projects pencil out. And it's kind of questionable whether it's going to qualify as social housing if it's down at 80%. Or they have this spreadsheet that they've been working through that kind of shows, like, if you have this many units at this income level and this many units at this income level, how the project finances work. And under the supervision of one of the board members, I was able to play around with this spreadsheet a little bit and try adding in a little bit of the higher income units as opposed to the lower income. And you can see how that balance makes a project either work and meet the bank's criteria or not work. You're taking some of social housing's tools away by lowering that ceiling to 80%. Now there is a possibility that they could pay for some portion of the building that goes up to 120% of area median income from some different funding source, but this sort of hobbles them in terms of what they can do.
Very interesting. And really quickly, I mean, the different funding sources, they would have different results, right? A dedicated funding source would bring in what amount of money expected, Joshua, for social housing versus peeling it off of the jumpstart tax like 1B suggests. What's the difference in total funding that's projected?
1A would bring in an estimated $50 million plus every year. It could be up to $57 million. That's what the initial estimates are. 1B would bring in $10 million a year, so a much smaller amount.
Of course, there is an option to vote no on both of these proposals if Seattle voters kind of throw up their hands and say, I don't like the idea of either one of these, 1A or 1B. Anything you want to, highlight about the argument for that?
Well, it could be that you don't have faith in this idea at all and that you just want housing to be built in the traditional way as it was before. Then you could choose to sort of quash any funding for this organization that way. There are some people who are saying, wait a minute, the social housing provider promised that they could do all this funding with just the low interest loans that they are authorized to make as a public development authority.
That was the promise that was made early on in the process of getting the PDA passed a couple of years ago.
Well, they dispute whether that is exactly sort of how it was pitched, but the opponents are currently saying that. They're saying, they kind of promised this.
Yeah, the goalposts are moving.
Yeah, but what they're telling me is that even if you want to go for a low interest loan, you still need to bring some collateral to the bank. You still need to bring some cash. And I saw this in the spreadsheets that I had a chance to sort of explore. If you go to buy a house in Seattle as a private citizen, you have to bring 20% of the loan. Down payment to the bank. And that same kind of thing is expected even of a low interest loan. So they say, look, without that kind of cash, we don't have a leg to stand on. We can't go forward. And yeah, I don't know how they do it without either one of these funding models.
Yeah, and you're hearing sort of shade being thrown from both sides, supporters of 1A, supporters of 1B. Just a reminder, social housing advocates, progressives, got the ballot measure qualified last year. And then the city council, which has a moderate majority, decided to put their own competing measure on the ballot. That's how we got 1B. And you hear in our conversation about 1B that kind of baked into it is the idea that they have skepticism about this new social housing developer, whether or not they're going to be able to fulfill promises, whether or not making a new funding source for a brand new agency is a great idea. But as you said, 1A, they're saying we need that in order to actually be effective and at building in very expensive Seattle. If 1A passes, Joshua, I mean, how soon could we actually see a social housing building existing in Seattle?
Well, sooner than you might think. I mean, to build a new building takes years. And so if they started getting money and they said, okay, we're going to build a new building, they'd have to hire a whole bunch of people, and then they'd have to, get the land, and then they have to hire an architect, all this stuff, get permits. I mean, 4 to 5 years for that, probably. However, they're also authorized to preserve existing affordable housing. If 1A passes, there's a lot of urgency built into how fast that funding will come. They could start to see funding as early as the end of the first quarter of this year, because the tax is actually retroactive to January 1st.
Oh, wow.
So So they would suddenly have a sort of first infusion of money. They could hire the people for their staff, and they could just go out and buy something that's existing. Former State House Speaker Frank Chopp is already sort of showing them properties because he's a big fan of social housing. And he's like, look, there's this property over here. They can't make this work financially. And some of those properties, they may be on the verge of selling to a developer who would just tear them down and put something much more expensive there. But the social housing developer could come in and buy that property and keep those units permanently affordable basically forever.
So social housing does exist in other places. Like when voters approved forming the Public Development Authority in 2023, I remember all this talk about Vienna, Austria, made me want to visit, seemed really nice. The city has a social housing model that is famous, I feel like, among urbanists. But this is also an idea that's, going beyond Vienna, beautiful Vienna, and taking shape in other communities, right, Joshua? Like, where else have they been exploring social housing?
There's some organizations that are trying to promote this idea and that are working with different cities to explore this idea. And, Atlanta just passed something. Montgomery County, Maryland is sort of the most famous example in our country that sort of has an established system.
Everybody says Montgomery County, very similar to Vienna. It's the Vienna of Maryland.
Yeah, but they don't have a lot of this housing under their belt. They've been doing mixed income housing for a long time, for decades. So that part of social housing, they've got a lot of experience in. But they basically created a revolving fund that turns over and over again and cycles money directly into social housing. But a lot of other cities are exploring it, beyond the ones who've adopted it already. Chicago, Chattanooga, some places in California. And anytime anybody introduces a bill proposing something like social housing, the social housing advocates are like, they're exploring it too. See how fast this idea is spreading.
Yeah.
They mark those all down as wins in their column, even if they haven't passed yet.
Building the buzz,
yeah.
Right? So part of the hope that I understand, at least, of social housing is that it doesn't just help the people who move into that building, that it provides competition for the free market, and that other units, the average landlord will have to look and say, oh my gosh, now there are these social housing buildings that are starting to open and they're setting the rent at XYZ, 30% of somebody's income. Therefore, I need to step up my game and start, thinking about affordability more, maybe lower rents or not raising rents at such a quick rate.
I think it's unrealistic that we'll experience that in Seattle at any time soon.
Yeah.
Simply because what we're talking about is a force that could come in and kind of dominate the market. And it would be, hey, how long would it take them? For example, in Vienna, which is one of the examples where they say the government actually has this influence over rents, supposedly 60% of the residents of Vienna live in social housing. So you can understand where if the government owns 60% of the housing, yeah, maybe it can have some kind of downward pressure on rents. But here, if we're talking about just getting a few buildings in the next few years, and gradually that will increase as they'll get more money, but it would be decades before they could have that kind of influence on the market.
What will you be watching for, Joshua, as the housing developer, the public housing developer, continues to figure out these big questions? Because no matter if 1A or 1B passes or neither passes, the social housing developer exists, right? What are you watching for as we wait to see what voters decide when it comes to the funding source for social housing?
I mean, I think the big thing to watch will be after this is adopted, if they get the money. It'll be really interesting to see how effectively they sort of rapidly form a responsive and transparent organization to spend this money. Because that's a lot of money. It's up to, I've heard quotes of like $57 million potentially coming in every year. That's a huge amount of money. And they're kind of starting from nothing. And they're this small board. Right now, recently, their treasurer, who is one of the appointees from the mayor, had to step down because he's taking another job. He said it was conflict of interest. So there's some of their institutional knowledge that's just sort of gone. They have to wait for the mayor to appoint somebody new. So there's a sort of slowness to what they've been able to do so far. And so I'll be watching to see how effectively they just totally transform themselves in response to this money. If 1B passes, they're going to have to completely sort of rethink how they talk about themselves, how many buildings they can produce, and it's going to be a
scaling back. I mean, much more modest.
Dramatically, yeah. And so will that failure of them to get the large dream sort of crush them, or can they sort of adapt to this smaller reality?
Joshua McNichols is the host of Booming from KUOW. Get it wherever you listen to podcasts, and he's also KUOW's growth and development reporter. Joshua, always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's it for Sound Politics today. Today's show was produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. I'm KUOW politics reporter Scott Greenstone.
I'm Libby Denkmann, and we'll be back next week with more Sound Politics. Consider supporting the show by making a donation if it makes sense for your budget. Link is in the show notes or at kuow.org/politics to give. See you next week.
See you next week.